Hello and welcome to Lesson 2 of our introductory course on NetSuite's Suite Cloud Development Framework here on SuiteHub. In the previous lesson, we discussed the major reasons that SDF is an important tool for any NetSuite developer to consider using. In this lesson, we established the foundation for understanding and using SDF. We're going to build that foundation by first defining the core concepts of SDF, installing SDF on our local machine, creating a new project, and then exploring that project's structure and configuration. The main concept to understand when learning SDF is the project. Project is the container for all of our files and objects associated with our customizations. It includes configuration files that specify dependencies and determine what gets validated and deployed into the account whenever we perform an SDF operation. Each project will consist of three major components: files, objects, and dependencies. Files are the content that will be stored in the file cabinet after a deployment. Usually, these are going to be the source files for our scripts, but they can be any type of file valid for the file cabinet. They might be images, HTML, PDF templates, many others. Objects are the XML definitions of our customizations: lists, records, fields, forms, etc. These are the objects that will get updated in the NetSuite account when we perform an SDF deployment. Lastly, dependencies are references to objects that are used by the project but not owned by the project. We use a dependency to signal that our project expects an object to exist in the target account, but does not define that object. SDF will validate that all required dependencies are met and present in the target account before it will successfully deploy a project. We will explore all of these components in greater detail with examples when we inspect an actual project. Now, it's crucial to keep in mind that files and objects that we add to a project should be considered owned by that project. All updates to those files and objects should be done through the SDF project. A file or object should only belong to one SDF project. You want to avoid maintaining multiple definitions in multiple projects because that will quickly become difficult to maintain consistency across all of those definitions. Now, each developer, team, and organization is going to need to decide for itself how best to organize their files and objects into projects. One approach is to have one single SDF project for all of your customizations. Another is to break your customizations down into smaller SDF projects and have dependencies between them. There's just no one-size-fits-all approach here. Later in the course, we will talk about some of the design considerations and why you might choose one approach over the other. But at this point, we have enough information to install SDF and explore a project. So let's do that. First, there are a few prerequisites that we need to set up in first our NetSuite account, then on our local machine. In NetSuite, we want to navigate to Setup, Company, Enable Features. Under the Suite Cloud tab, we want to ensure that token-based authentication is enabled and Suite Cloud Development Framework is enabled. Switching over to our local machine, you will need to install the following software: the Java Development Kit version 17, Node.js version 16 at least, and the Node Package Manager, which is generally packaged with Node. Now, because our operating systems and our development environments can vary so widely, I can't give everyone complete installation instructions for these prerequisites, so you'll have to consult the documentation for your own system where it's appropriate. Quickly, I can see that I have the version 17 of the JDK. using the javac command. I have the version 18.8 of Node.js and 9.4.2 of NPM. With these prerequisites installed, SDF itself can be obtained in a number of different formats. It is distributed as a plugin for the WebStorm and VS Code development environments. It is distributed as a Java command line interface and a Node.js command line interface. In this course, we're going to use the Node.js CLI in a Linux operating system. And we're focusing on Node as that will provide the basis for future automations in our deployment and software development lifecycle operations. Although we won't be covering automation in this course beyond what you can do with SDF itself. Now we're ready to actually install SDF, and we do so using the npm install command. Quickly, before we do that, I'm going to hop over to the GitHub repository for SDF, which has installation instructions. We can do that in a single command, but there are two versions of that command. The first is here, npm install-g, the global flag, and the package name. That makes sure we can run the commands, the SweetCloud commands, from anywhere in our file system rather than just the current directory wherever we install it. But Oracle requires that we agree to terms of service before we use SDF. So the second version, the first version will prompt you to agree, and the second version skips that with this flag. So I've already accepted this, but I'm going to copy, paste, run that command. There we go. We have our package installed, and we can test whether it's working by just typing SweetCloud. We should get output that looks like this. It's a list of options and commands for the SweetCloud CLI. Now, in case you are not familiar with NPM or you run into trouble here, there will be some useful tips and links down below the video. As we can see, though, when we run SweetCloud without any parameters, we get the usage documentation for SDF. Essentially, installing the package has installed this SweetCloud command on our machine. And in the usage documentation here, we can see that all SweetCloud operations follow the same syntax. We have the SweetCloud keyword followed by a namespace, operation name, and then some options after that. SweetCloud is the root command and will be the prefix for every operation we want to run. Namespace and operation specify which action we want to take, and then the options are the specific parameters for that operation. At the top of the documentation, we can see a few options which are common to all or most SDF operations. First, every operation offers a help switch, which will display the documentation for that specific command. The shorthand for --help is -h. There is also a version switch that will display the currently installed version of SDF, as we saw above. And finally, some operations provide an interactive mode, which will launch the operation and then prompt you for inputs instead of reading the inputs from the options flags. Shorthand for interactive mode is usually -i. Now, we just talked about how the project is the primary container for our customizations. So in order to put SDF to use, we start by creating a project. We create a project if we scan through the commands here by running the create operation from the project namespace. To get more information on how this command works, we invoke it with its help option. That can be --help or simply -h. Project create -h. This will show us all of the options and a brief description of the command. In the next lesson, we'll go through all of the operations, all of the commands, and all of their options in detail. But for right now, all I want to do is create a project so that we can explore its structure and its configuration. To do that, we're going to run the command in its interactive mode so that SDF walks us through the creation of a project. The output of the project create command is a new directory with the same name that we give to our project. The new directory will contain all of the default scaffolding for our SDF project, its configuration files, and the directory structure for organizing all of our custom objects and files. Interactive mode is the -I option. And the first choice we are prompted with is whether our project is a Suite app or a account customization. In this course, we're going to focus exclusively on account customization projects, but everything we discuss will still be applicable to Suite app projects. Suite apps add extra layers on top of account customization projects, and we just won't be discussing those extra layers. So I will choose account customization project. Next, we give the project a name. Now, primarily, like I said, this will be the name of the directory that gets created. It will also show up in one of the project's configuration files. So give your project a recognizable name that fits with your directory naming scheme. For our purposes, I'll call it Lesson 2. Lastly, SDF asks if we want to install the unit testing framework into our project. This is another NPM package made by the SDF team that adds unit testing capabilities into SweetScript. It's based on the Jest unit testing framework. In practice, I always add this to my SDF projects. I believe unit testing is incredibly important for NetSuite development. In this course, however, we won't be covering unit testing, as that could be a course all of its own. So I won't be installing it on this demonstration, but feel free to if you want to explore the unit testing on your own. And that's all. We have a brand new project. Let's investigate it. Through the magic of time travel, I have closed WebStorm and reopened it with our new project as the root. If we now inspect our project, we see a source directory and a suitecloud.config.js file. Those have both been created by the SweetCloud command. But before we look into the configuration settings, we'll take a little tour of the source directory. This directory and its subdirectories are where we will place all of our customization definitions and script files. Within the source directory, we see several files and subdirectories. The file cabinet directory contains several subdirectories of its own, and all of these correspond to the target account's file cabinet. Any files we place in, say, the SweetScripts directory will get deployed to the SweetScripts directory in the file cabinet. So this will normally be where we store the source files for all of our scripts. Any subdirectories we create below SweetScripts within our project will then be replicated in the file cabinet upon deployment, which we can use to our advantage to keep our source files organized both locally in our project as well as in the file cabinet. The templates directory allows us to deploy email and marketing template files using those respective subdirectories. The website hosting files directory allows us to deploy files to the live and staging versions of our NetSuite hosted website using those subdirectories. The objects directory will contain all of the XML definitions for our custom lists and records and fields, any other customization objects we want to add to our project. XML files stored here can be organized into subdirectories as well. The translation directory will contain the XML and XLF definitions of translation collections, which you can use in your project to do localization. Lastly, the account configuration directory can be used to enable or disable features in the target account. We move on to the configuration files. Two different XML files were created, deploy.xml and manifest.xml. The manifest.xml file describes some metadata about our project and its external dependencies. Initially, looking at it here, it's just the project's type and its name, as well as the version of the SweetCloud framework we used to generate the project. Later, when we've added objects and dependencies in our project, this file will get a lot more interesting and useful. In deploy.xml, this defines which files and which objects will be validated and deployed when we run those SweetCloud operations. A default configuration here is created for us, and this default configuration will deploy to the target account all files that we place under the file cabinet path, all objects we place under the objects folder, all translations collections we place under translations, and all account configuration settings we deploy under account configuration. You can use this file to deviate from this default structure if you want. If you want a completely different file structure or project, you can do that using this file. When you specify any of these paths, you can see that the asterisk is the wildcard. You can use that to represent any or all files in a particular folder, but you cannot use it as a wildcard within a directory or file name, as you might expect. So I couldn't do something like this, where it would deploy all count prefixed folders. That is not valid. Be sure to note the usage of the tilde symbol at the front of all of these paths. This is a special symbol that refers to the project's root directory. By default, that is the source directory, but this is configurable from the SweetCloud config file, which we'll look at now. The SweetCloud configuration file is a setup file for the SweetCloud command. It is a JavaScript module which gets loaded and executed before every SweetCloud operation that we run in the command. And it exports an object containing properties that can change the behavior of those SweetCloud commands for our project. Because it's a standard JavaScript file, we can add any valid JavaScript to it that we want. We primarily use it to sort of establish the environment which our SweetCloud operations run in. So for a quick example, I just want to add some log statements here, and we'll observe where that output gets displayed when we actually run a SweetCloud command. We've added a before and after console log statement that should print out in the terminal when they execute. We'll go actually run the validate command. We're not concerned about this error here. We just haven't set up account authorization yet. That's fine. What we should see is our before and after statements. And based on where they display, we can see that the entire config file is executed before the operation runs in the command line. If we now turn our attention back to the config file, I will remove our logs. And we can see that the first configurable property in our exports object is default project folder. By default, we can see this is set to source, but this is where we set what directory is mapped to the tilde in deploy.xml. If we want to change the default project root folder to something besides source or maybe something underneath source, we can do that here. We can also do it on a per command basis. We'll look at that a little later. Next up, the commands property. This allows us to customize how individual operations behave. Every SweetCloud operation supports a number of customizable properties. We can use this structure to specify default options or default parameters for our operations. And every operation supports 3 different event hooks: a before executing event, an on completed event, and an on error event. And we can use this structure to write functions which get called or invoked every time one of those events is fired. Now, this will all be best illustrated by an example. So let's customize how the file create operation works. We will explore all the specifics of this operation later, but for now, let's write a message to the console before the file creation operation runs. We do that using the before executing hook of the file create. All right. As always, the code here will be available in the GitHub repo, linked to the lesson down below. But now, when we run the file create command, we should see our message show up before any output from SweetCloud. SweetCloud file create. And here is our message. We can see it runs before any output from SweetCloud. So always remember that this configuration file is a JavaScript file. We can write valid JavaScript code inside this function, inside this file, anything that will run in a node environment where the SweetCloud operation is running. In addition to supporting event hook functions, the objects for an operation also support changing the directory in which the operation runs. We can do this by setting a project folder property at the operation level. For example, maybe we store all of our source files and objects in the source directory as usual, but we only ever deploy what is in the dist directory. We can do this by setting the project folder property on the project deploy command. With this configuration, the deploy command will look at, or rather, the tilde in deploy.xml when we run the deploy command will be mapped to this dist directory instead of the source directory. We will look at a lot more usages of these event hooks and these properties that are configurable when we explore specific operations, as well as when we start combining operations into practical day-to-day processes. And I think right here is a good place to end this lesson. We've explored the concepts, the configuration, and structure of an SDF project. The next lesson, we'll start putting that information to use, using our project to manage customizations within a NetSuite account. As always, be sure to visit the course's Slack channel if you have any questions or answers for myself or your fellow students. If you have any connections or colleagues who you think might benefit from either this course or the SweetHub platform, please share a link with them. And thank you once again for being here. I'll catch you in the next lesson.